Hey there, welcome back to Visual Communications Multimedia 110. I'm Curtis Stage here at Los Angeles Mission College. So today is lecture number 7, and we're going to be looking at early graphic design. To start out, I want to kind of talk about who coined the term graphic design. So it's kind of interesting that nobody ever thinks about that. They just think, oh, it's just a term that's been around forever. But actually, it was coined in 1922 by a book designer, William Addison Dwiggins. He was a typesetter, illustrator. He was working in, he was working in design, you could say, as a book designer, and decided that he wanted to create books that had more artistic merit to them. So his whole goal was to elevate book covers and the kind of inside sleeves, typography within the books. He wanted to elevate them to an art form. He kind of was seeing that books were kind of becoming boring and wanted to really kind of change the way we looked at books. So that was how that started, and he coined the term graphic design. So this book cover by Dwiggins shows this new way of thinking, right? That seeing is as important as reading. He really felt that way, that looking at objects just as important as the written text, and that typography and illustration could be used for symbolism. So Dwiggins worked most of his life in advertising and released the book Layout in Advertising in 1928. So the first graphic design movement I want to talk about is Futurism. So Futurism actually started off as an art movement, and that was occurring kind of in the late 1800s, and then it moved into the 1900s. And now where Futurism came from was, there was Cubism going on at the time. So some of you have taken my Multimedia 100 class, and we do a Cubism project in there. Futurism and Cubism were kind of similar. They were going hand in hand. The Futurists were more from Italy, and the Cubists were more from Spain. So there wasn't really kind of a clash here, but the Futurists were really looking at society and how mechanized it was becoming, similar to the Cubists. And this was a movement, though, that was not, that moved from art to graphic design. So Cubism really stayed in the art world. Artists like Picasso, George Braque, those were artists, and they did not become graphic designers. The Futurists from Italy were artists, and they decided to ditch art. They're like, we don't want to make art anymore. We want to make posters and graphics. So there was a big shift in society and technology at the time, right? We get the advent of the telephone, the first incandescent light bulbs are happening. Trains are kind of going in full steam here. Cars have been invented in 1906, 07. Airplanes invented. So there's a lot of technology happening in the early 1900s, and the Futurists were seeing the world as a technological new frontier. And their work, if you look at it, was very, the graphic work that they were doing when they moved out of art and moved into graphic design, a lot of it was influenced by the mechanized society that we started to become. So you would see this occurred not only in their shapes that they were using, but also in their colors they were using. Very minimalist, work that was very text-based as well. So they were really thinking about kind of how text and images work together. And so you would see things like these posters where they're, and they look great today even. These posters would be exciting for people today as designers, but these were, you can see that they were treating text and fonts and typeface. They were treating that just like they'd be treating an image. So it was a really exciting time in this early graphic design movement of Futurism. And they like to call the movement themselves, they like to call it machine aesthetics. That's what they were thinking about as they were creating the language for this early design movement. So Futurism originated by Filippo Marinetti in 1909. He rejected the past, set out to celebrate a number of abstract concepts like speed, machinery, like I was saying, the Industrial Revolution, violence, youth, and industry. And he wanted to go more abstract. So artists were doing this, Cubists were doing this, and Marinetti was feeling like designers need to go this route as well. And he had radical ideas as well. So his Futurism Manifesto, which basically wanted to destroy the past, and he thought that anarchist violence was an answer. So he's a very interesting character within the movement of futurism, and he really was a jumping off point for the next group of artists in the Dada movement. So Dadaism was kind of an anti-art movement, right? It's considered non-art. Essentially, the artists didn't want to make art. They wanted to kind of like Banksy today in a way, where we see Banksy as a street artist, and he's kind of saying that the art world is ridiculous. And I don't know if some of you saw this. Is just this week there was a Christie's auction house or Sotheby's auction house where they were selling one of his paintings, I guess, for 1.2 million. And the painting had a frame around it. It was up on the wall. The bid was going through. The auctioneer banged the gavel because someone bought it. And then the painting started shredding itself. So it was like moving down through the frame and shredding itself. Pretty awesome. So very anti-art. And the Dadaists would have loved this, right? So they wanted to break the tradition of art aesthetics and rationality. They used found objects, right, and combined materials, and they weren't just graphic designers. These were artists and writers and philosophers. In fact, they didn't make much work. Again, it was about anti-art, but the things they did make really changed the way people looked at visual communication through design and through art. They liked collage. They liked using combos of materials, photographic images that were cut out right from newspapers and magazines at the time. And again, they didn't consider what they did art at all. Again, it was an anti-art movement. They wanted to break away from traditional styles of art aesthetics. And in fact, they wanted to break away from rationality as a whole, kind of like the futurists, but they weren't violent. So this was kind of took a little step in another direction. They did want to reject reason and logic, so their art was, I guess some of it was kind of fun. Some of the design was kind of fun. A lot of it didn't make sense, and I think a few surrealist artists picked up on this as well. Somebody like Salvador Dali, although he was not considered a Dadaist, his work was strange and definitely rejected reason and logic. Surrealists came from a much more internal mode, whereas Dadaists were reacting to culture around them. And they really wanted to, because of World War I, they reacted to that quite a bit. And they were protesting in the streets quite a bit, lots of pamphlets. And in those pamphlets and protest materials and their writings, all of it was designed. And whether they were thinking of it as design or not, the Dadaists became pretty revolutionary in their design practices, and maybe because they were just doing something so radical and new, right? So this was a really, really good jumping off point for graphic designers, and you can see some of this work here. Lots of text heavy. Fonts and text were just as much a part of the image as an image, right? As a drawing or a painting. They viewed words as objects. So really great ideas in terms of graphic design, especially for typography. They created their own typography, and they were doing very crude printing and lithography, so they could make lots of pamphlets and brochures. But some of the things were just hand pressed with wood blocks, right? So you'd see almost kind of like punk rock posters. In fact, this is what I kind of relate Dada posters to. They seemed very similar to late 70s, early 80s punk rock posters in London and New York and Los Angeles. So they were an interesting group, and they really rejected the past ideas of art, and they wanted to create a new form of art and design, and it heavily influenced poster design and early graphic advertising. Whether they liked it or not, it just kind of happened. Dadaism was occurring in and around Germany and in Belgium, France. It was kind of spread around Europe, and it led to the next art movement, which was the style, which De Stijl is the style. And this is a Dutch art movement and design movement. And they took a utopian approach to aesthetics. And they really thought about things as functional, really functional. They liked this idea of rejecting the past ideas about art, and they wanted to create a new form of art. But theirs was different than Dadaists. They were kind of going the opposite way, where Dadaists were rejecting reason and logic. De Stijl artists were embracing reason and logic. So you've got this move towards abstraction, this move towards simplicity, move towards basic fonts and basic shapes and geometry, but two different reasons for these things were happening. The Dadaists were kind of destroying logic and reason, and De Stijl artists and designers were saying, oh no, we like logic and reason. So they wanted to get to the core of reality. That was their idea. So in general, De Stijl proposed ultimate simplicity and abstraction, right? Both in architecture and painting and design, they only use straight, horizontal, and vertical and rectangular forms. So very elemental principles of design. And we can see in here that some of the key art was very geometric. So again, not just painting and graphic design. They were also in architecture and industrial design, furniture making, every kind of art you can think of. This Dutch movement was a part of, and it was a philosophy just as much of it as a design art movement. Right? It was just as much a philosophy. Their formal vocabulary was limited to primary colors, right? Red, yellow, blue, 3 primary colors, and they used black, white, and gray. And their works avoided symmetry, right? I guess this chair here on the right, that kind of feels very symmetrical. But the building on the left, very unsymmetrical or, asymmetrical. So the balance of the building is off, quite a bit. And so their works avoided symmetry, right? And they attained aesthetic balance by the use of opposition. They like to oppose things to create balance. Really amazing kind of styles from this art form. So Theo van Doesburg and Piet Mondrian were two of the heavy hitters in De Stijl. And here's a great quote by Mondrian. I love this quote. This new plastic idea, I like how plastic idea, will ignore the particulars of appearance, that is to say, natural form and color. On the contrary, it should find its expression in the abstraction of form and color, that is to say, in the straight line and the clearly defined primary color. And that painting on the right, or that design on the right, is kind of a subway system. So downtown at night is what I think that title is called. It doesn't look like at night at all, but definitely you can see it looks like a Google map, maybe, from above. So these guys were creating very, some would say, some people maybe don't like this work because it seems boring and very abstract, too removed from the, kind of normal everyday way we envision the world. But they wanted to strip down the world into its basic forms. And I think that was what was interesting. And it may have had a short-lived lifespan, but it influenced both artists and designers with this reduction to the idea of pure form. Again, they were trying to get to pure form. It was almost a spiritual endeavor in a way through design and through art. It really was. And it influenced a lot of artists later to come and designers. So at the same time that De Stijl was going on, the Bauhaus movement was occurring. And Bauhaus was mostly in Berlin, in Germany. And it approach to design was a combination of fine arts and crafts. Bauhaus was interesting because they did not want to separate the arts. They thought that art, architecture, design, music, everything was connected. And there was no separation between design and art, advertising and art, architecture and art. It was all one thing. And they rode the coattails of De Stijl, and they were in favor of plainness and being conducive to mass production, right? They wanted to be able to produce things on a large scale so that everybody could have them. It was very democratic in a way, socialist or democratic, where it was like, hey, we want to make these things for the masses. And they also though wanted everything that they built to have a real integrity to it. So the furniture, the architecture, anything that was physical that they built, they wanted to make sure that the best materials were used and that it was built properly. So they were kind of really making sure that their workmanship was at a high level. So these were people who were very so they also like streamlining aesthetics, just basically just like Distill, right? They liked the basic form and color, not veering too much out into crazy colors. But you'll see the Bauhaus used a lot of black and red in a lot of the things that they produced. They were founded by Walter Gropius in Weimar, Germany, and it opened its doors in 1919. And it really kind of, Bauhaus was flourishing from 1919 to right before World War II. And then the Nazis, who really actually stole a lot of Bauhaus ideas in their propaganda material and in their architecture and their design. Note all the Nazi flags and the swastika and the black and the red. They stole that from Bauhaus. These artists and designers were not Nazis. And they all fled Germany for the most part. They all fled Germany and left to other parts of Europe and to England and to the United States. But the Nazi Party kind of stole a lot of their ideas. I don't think they understood their ideas, but they liked the modernity of Bauhaus, and they really love the black and red, which is quite clear when you get to the Nazi Party. The other thing to note too, and you've probably heard this phrase before, is form follows function. And the Bauhaus movement, they founded the idea of purpose-driven design in all areas of the arts, right? What does form follows function mean? That something does not work if the function of it is not thought of first. So you can only make a form if it goes with some sort of function. So they really believed in functional objects. Not everything that they made looked very functional all the time to us, to the outsider, but at the time it looked very functional. So this was their idea, though, that form follows function. And we still use that today. You'll hear a cabinet maker use that. You'll hear people, somebody who designs a chair. The form of the chair follows the function of it. We sit in the chair, so the form follows the function. Walter Gropius, this piece on the left, really cool. Drawing for maybe a building. He was an architect by trade, and he was drawing very experimental buildings. But you can see in that drawing how, and this is going to be interesting with a later artist, but you can see in that drawing how the architecture and design are both working together. It's not differentiating between the two. They are working as one. And we see this today with architects. If you look at Disney Hall is designed in such a way where the design of it and the building of it, there's no real difference in that. The architecture looks like it could have been a drawing on a piece of paper, that it almost looks impossible. It's very design oriented as well. Herbert Meyer on the right, that's an example of some of his graphics work. Again, really simple shapes. And these guys had a major influence on development of graphic design, as well as much of the 20th century modern art, especially when we got to minimalist art in the 60s and 70s. So a good 30 years later, artists were, really looking at these guys as influencers. In fact, Bayer made a font face, since we talked about fonts last time, that was called he wanted to call it the universal typeface. This was what he thought a typeface should look like, and that universally should be used by everybody. And I love it. You notice that D looks kind of like the Beats Audio B, just flipped around. But anyways, this was an example of his typeface that he created. And it's still in use today. You can still use this universal typeface. So one of the premier artists in this movement of Bauhaus was Laszlo Moholy-Nagy. I know it looks like Nagy, but it's pronounced Nagy, and I just always I just cringe when people get that name wrong. But it's Laszlo Moholy-Nagy, and he was living in Germany, teaching at Bauhaus, became the director in 1923, and really became the foremost practitioner of Bauhaus. And he was a pioneering figure in photography, typography, sculpture, industrial design, printmaking. He also got into film and set design, exhibition design, and of course, book design and advertising. So Nagy was this, really amazing at all of them too, because, usually when you think about an artist, a designer, an architect, you don't want them to be doing multiple things. You usually want them to concentrate on the thing that they do the best. And I always tell my students that. I tell my artists, my designers, hey, get really good at this thing that you're good at. But, this multidisciplinary approach, he was very fond of it. In fact, Bauhaus was in general, right? They wanted all the arts to become one, and he was the practitioner of that. I like these quotes. Designing is not a profession, but an attitude. It's thinking in relationships. Love that. One of my favorite quotes in design. And then the next one. Design is the integration of technological, social, economical requirements, biological necessities, and the psychological effects of materials, shape, color, volume, and space. Yeah, and the same could be said for architecture and art and furniture, great design in general. This guy's work was incredible, and his graphic design work was one thing, and I just kind of want to end on him here. We're going to pick up, we're going to talk more about graphic design in this class in the weeks to come, but he is a pivotal figure in graphic design when we get to graphic design today, because if you look at this work outside of the color tone here, these things could have been done today. He was really the first person to start using photo montage. You can see in a design way, heavily using photo montage. A few other people were using it as well, but in Futurism they were using it, Dada they were using it, but he really started using it quite a bit and taking his own photos to create the photo montages. And he was doing these photo montages. A lot of them were collage cutouts, but a lot of them he would create the collage cutouts and then retake the photos of those collage cutouts, and then that photo then would become the print or the lithograph that would be used for the lithograph, right? And then he would apply graphics over the top. So his process was very artistic, and it created some of the most amazing work of the 20th century. He's one of my favorite artists and designers of all time, and I love his artwork. Here's some of his artwork where you can see we've got, some paintings in here, this cool collage of these three people, but you can see that he's pulling in some of the influences of Bauhaus and De Stijl, and he's bringing this into his fine artwork. The photo, he was an amazing photographer too, and filmmaker, and he could sculpt as well. I love this guy. And this photo on the right, if you just squint and look at it, don't even think about it as, okay, there's three sailors there and we're looking at it from up top straight down, but squint with your eyes and look at that, and it is exactly a composition that he would paint or draw with graphic elements. His photographs were also, he thought of them as very graphic, and he was an amazing artist. So that concludes early graphic design. We will talk more about graphic design. We're going to get into some kind of middle graphic design after World War II into the 1980s and 90s. So that's going to be a future lecture. So we'll talk to you soon.